Sonic, the heart of your system.
Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are looking at the new Dream Machines P960RN gaming laptop. Many of you may know Dream Machines for their gaming mice, but the company does also sell laptops as well, and Fierce PC is now selling these here in the UK. So they sent over this P960RN model for review. It's priced at just over £2,000, but for your money you get the Intel i7 9750H. There's also an RTX 2080 Max-Q graphics, you get 16GB of 2666MHz DDR4 memory, and there's also a 500GB Samsung NVMe SSD. As for the display, this is a 16.1-inch 1080p IPS 144Hz panel. So considering the price is, like we said, just over £2,000, just how good is this machine? Well, to answer that question, we'll start with the overall look at the design, as considering the core spec, this chassis is actually surprisingly portable. The P960RN actually weighs in at just over 2 kilos, 2.09 kilos to be exact, and the chassis thickness is officially rated at 19.9 millimeters. That being said, you do have to kind of factor in the mouse feet as well, so if we measure it from the table, total thickness is more like 25 millimeters, but this is actually still surprisingly sleek and portable, so you actually have no problems carrying this around in a backpack with you, unlike some slightly thicker models which will have similar hardware. So definitely from a kind of portability perspective, the laptop gets off to a good start. Additionally, the P960RN also boasts a metal lid, the keyboard deck itself is also metal, and the underside panel is also made of metal, so it's got actually quite a high quality and premium feeling construction. It doesn't feel quite as premium or as solid as something like the Razer Blade or the MacBook Pro. They both have unibody aluminium designs, but even then I notice very little flex when applying pressure to the inside of the chassis, and there's not really any more screen flex than I'd typically expect to see when trying to stress the top panel. So overall, not only does the laptop look good, I think it also is quite well built and looks quite premium as well. Moving on now to talk about the general feature set of this laptop, we'll start by talking about the keyboard. So this is a full-size board with a numpad on the right-hand side, and I have to say I did get on with it quite well day to day. The first thing I would say is it's not a low-profile mechanical keyboard which we have seen on some similarly priced laptops, but the key travel is actually surprisingly decent considering just how thin this machine is, and the actuation as well is pretty decent with a good amount of tactile feedback, and it certainly doesn't feel kind of mushy or spongy. The one thing I would say is that the RGB lighting isn't really that impressive. It doesn't get that bright, and the software control isn't really that sophisticated, so it's again not really up to the same level as something like a Razer Blade. But then again, I also do think you have to factor in the kind of person who's looking to buy this laptop probably isn't too concerned about the RGB on the keyboard. The trackpad as well is also a similarly decent area of this machine. My initial thought was, yeah, I do think it could be a bit bigger. There's definitely a bit more space to make it wider and also slightly taller. This is one area where particularly Apple's MacBooks have done really well for the last year or two. So I do think the trackpad could be a little bit bigger. But then what you do get is actually a very usable trackpad. It's got a really smooth, nice top surface, so I was able to use multi-finger gestures no problem at all, and two-finger scrolling, that kind of thing, absolutely fine. There are also those two discrete buttons which do feel ever so slightly mushy, but again, really not that bad whatsoever. Obviously, if you are going to be using the trackpad, you'll probably be in a cafe or a library or something, and it will definitely do the job there. But of course, if you are doing any kind of semi-serious gaming, you'll want to use a mouse. So for the times that you need to use it, the trackpad is definitely more than good enough. Another key area for a machine, especially one this thin, is going to be the connectivity in terms of the I/O ports. Here, I'm actually pleased to say that the Dream Machines P960RN actually does really well considering just how thin it is, as there is plenty of connectivity options. If we start over with the left-hand side of the machine now, here there are a total of 3 USB ports. 2 of these are USB 3.1 Gen 1, one Type A and then one Type C, but there's also a second USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type C port. Alongside that, we also have a mini DisplayPort output as well as a full-size HDMI. Over on the right hand side now, here we have another USB 3.1 Gen 1 Type A. There's also dual audio jacks, an SD card reader, full size I might add, and also an Ethernet port. The only kind of thing that stands out to me is no Thunderbolt, but then again I think it really does depend on your use case if you need that kind of high speed connectivity. For most gamers, it's probably not a huge deal, and then again we do also have to factor in the price, but it is definitely something worth noting. The next thing to come on to is the display. So the first thing we'll mention here is the size. This is rather unusual at 16.1 inches. So the obvious thing here being that the size is generally what we'd expect from a traditional 15.6 inch laptop in terms of the overall chassis dimensions. But because the bezels are quite thin, they've obviously managed to go with a slightly larger screen, so you get that little extra ½ inch of space in a body that typically isn't much larger than a typical 15.6 inch laptop. On top of that, it is also a pretty impressive panel. Like we said, it's full HD, 1080p, and it also boasts a 144Hz refresh rate. It is worth noting that there is no G-Sync or FreeSync, but honestly, I didn't really notice that I missed those features when gaming. Everything felt buttery smooth, but obviously we're going to come on to our games testing a little bit later on. Aside from the 144Hz refresh rate though, which is obviously going to be vital for our gaming, I'm also pleased to say that the panel itself is very high quality. Firstly, we measured 98% sRGB gamut coverage, and the peak brightness at just under 300 nits is also very respectable. Additionally, the most impressive area for me was the overall colour accuracy, with an average delta E value of 1.22, so that is actually a really impressive result for a laptop. I have to admit, when I saw the price of this machine and kind of the core specs within it, I did think the display might be one area that they kind of cut back, used a lower quality panel to kind of save on cost, but that really isn't the case for the P960RN. So that is pretty much it for our overall look of the design and the general feature set of this laptop, and we're now going to talk about gaming performance. Just to recap the core spec for you guys, the CPU is Intel's 6-core i7-9750H, which is a 45-watt part, and while gaming we typically saw clock speeds hover between 3.5 and 3.7 GHz across all cores. As for the GPU, this is the RTX 2080 Max-Q. It's important to note with Max-Q there are various configurations. This GPU has been configured to a 90-watt power budget, so that does mean clock speeds weren't really that high, certainly not as high as we'd expect from a Max-P part, but we still saw average clock speeds hover around the 1500 MHz range while gaming. There's also 16GB of DDR4 2666 MHz memory, and storage comes from a 500GB Samsung 970 EVO Plus. As for how well that all performs, we'll put our testing charts up for you now, guys. So at 1080p, we really are getting some frame rates, which is really going to make the most of that 144Hz display. In titles like World War Z and F1 2019, typically less demanding titles, there we saw frame rates average well over 100 FPS, and even in games like Gears 5 and The Division 2, which are a bit more demanding, average frame rate was still in the 80 to 90 frame per second region. So that really is highly impressive stuff, and that is again all at ultra settings. So in titles like Gears 5 and Division 2, if you do want to get a bit more, you want to get over 100 frames per second, you are going to get a decent boost just by dropping the quality back down to high. We also tested Red Dead Redemption 2 using the Vulkan API. This game is well known to be an absolute beast to run, so we tested it at high settings, and there we saw average frame rate just below 77 frames per second, which is still a very respectable result. It gets you over that 60 FPS mark, so you're still getting a smoother gaming experience. Overall then, you really will have a very positive time gaming with the P960RN. I really do think that a 2080 Max-Q is perfectly suited to 1080p 144Hz. Since there's not really any 1440p panel options, the next step up realistic would be 4K 60, which I think is too much for this GPU. But 1080p across this screen size I think works really well, and then you also get the benefit of those high frame rates. One slight negative to mention now in terms of the overall laptop's performance comes when looking at CPU intensive scenarios. Here we simply see quite similar results to what we've seen from other laptops in the past, like the Razer Blade, where if you put a 6-core laptop in a chassis this thin, performance does drop off as the processor does have to dial back its core clock, as it really can't sustain high frequencies in a chassis this thin, it just gets too hot. So for example, if we look at a run in Cinebench R20, here our processor started off the run clocking around 4 GHz, so actually quite fast, but obviously it really couldn't sustain that, and actually with the core clock that high, we did see some temperatures spiking up to 99C on certain cores. So by the end of a Cinebench R20 run, total clock speed was more like 2.6 to 2.8 GHz across all cores. Those lower speeds aren't really that impressive. It's actually worth saying that the base clock for the 9750H is actually 2.6 GHz, so we're really dropping back from, turboing up to 4 GHz all the way down to base clock. So that does result in decreased performance in applications like Cinebench. We also saw slightly lower physics scores from our 3D Mark Firestrike and Time Spy runs as well. That said, I would stress that we really only saw this behavior occur in CPU intensive workloads like Cinebench. In gaming, this really doesn't happen. The CPU is simply not stressed nearly as much, so the clock speed is able to stay a lot higher. That's not saying it's, not something to consider. It really depends how you're going to use this laptop. If you did want to use it for some gaming, but then you also wanted to do some video editing or rendering, you might notice a slight slowdown as the CPU just gets too hot and has to kind of scale back its core clocks. Then again, this is primarily a gaming laptop, so for me, I don't see it as a huge deal, but like we said, it is definitely something worth noting if you were looking for something which you could use for also work and play. A final point to consider in this performance section is also going to be in regards to our SSD. So like we said, this is a 500GB Samsung 970 EVO Plus. This is a drive we know really well. It's very, very fast. It posted really strong benchmark results. The problem for me though is just the 500GB capacity. In 2019, that really isn't enough. It's the only drive in the laptop, and after I actually installed the 5 games that I used to benchmark for our performance testing, I was only left with 90GB of free space, which is actually not even enough to install certain, huge games. I think Red Dead Redemption 2 itself is over 100GB. So for me personally, 500GB really isn't enough in this day and age. I can obviously appreciate that they are trying to keep costs down considering the core spec and that the fact the laptop only costs just over £2,000, but I definitely would have liked an extra, maybe a terabyte HDD or, an extra SSD just to give you a bit more storage space. We're now going to move on to talk about our temperature testing. So starting with the CPU, we already mentioned in our performance segment that during a run of Cinebench R20, the clock speed does have to scale down fairly significantly. So with the chart up now, the figure you can see with a peak reading of 70 degrees during Cinebench is actually the figure we saw once the clock speed had settled at 2.6 to 2.8 GHz. In fact, at the beginning of the run, like we said, with the clock speed still kind of boosting up to 4 GHz, there we did see some cores hitting 99 degrees. We did see high temperatures with the CPU while gaming, with a peak figure of 85 degrees when testing Red Dead Redemption 2, but then again we do also have to remember this is with significantly higher clock speeds, around 3.5 to 3.7 GHz, and that figure is still nothing to worry about. As for the graphics now, I didn't actually see the 2080 Max-Q run any hotter than 68 degrees, and that was while playing Red Dead Redemption 2 or even after a 30-minute Firestrike Ultra stress test. Here in gaming, we typically saw clock speed around the 1500 up to 1550 MHz range, which is still a very solid frequency. It's well above the rated boost clock of 1095 MHz. So overall, I'd say very impressive stuff in terms of the GPU temperatures. It is worth making clear though that the fans do have to spin up quite fast to keep the temperatures in check, and we actually saw fan speed measuring in at 6000 RPM according to the software. So obviously that does create a fair bit of noise, with peak noise level readings of around 54 decibels for this laptop. That is, I wouldn't say it's the loudest laptop I've ever heard, but it is definitely not quiet, so you will want to game with a headset on, and anyone else in the room with you is likely going to be a little bit annoyed. But I think as things go, again, considering how thin this chassis is, noise level is pretty much par for the course for a high performance gaming laptop. The last area to touch on now is going to be battery life, and here I was actually surprisingly impressed with the results we saw. So obviously this machine isn't going to last you all day away from the wall, or even 3 hours based on our testing, but with a score of 1 hour 48 in our PC Mark benchmark, that is actually a comparatively good result compared to some other machines with similar specs. So Overall, the battery life is just about okay, so if you do have to use it in a pinch in a library or in a cafe, it might last you ever so slightly longer than some other machines, but obviously for any gaming or high intensive performance you are going to want to connect to the mains. So then, wrapping up this review, overall I have to say I'm actually really impressed with the Dream Machines P960RN. Clearly its biggest selling point is going to be the combination of i7-9750H and RTX 2080 Max-Q graphics, all for a price of just over £2,000. So you really get impressive bang for buck, and the average frame rates we saw from this machine while gaming are really impressive. On top of that, the display itself also did really well in our tests. It's 144Hz, so you get a really smooth gaming experience. And then this is all delivered in a thin and light chassis, which I think looks good and also feels nice and premium. On top of that, the keyboard and trackpad as well are generally decent, so overall using the P960RN day to day is a very positive experience. The main downside for me when assessing this machine definitely is going to be that CPU kind of scaling back its frequency in CPU intensive workloads, as that is going to result in decreased performance if you are doing, things that are going to stress the CPU. Then again, you do also have to consider who is this laptop aimed at. It's definitely primarily a gaming laptop. So if you are someone who did want to get work and play done on this machine, you might be served better by something slightly thicker, which is just going to be able to dissipate the heat from that processor a bit better. But in my view, I don't see it as a huge problem for the P960RN. I think it's clearly aimed as a gaming laptop, and we saw, really good frequencies from the CPU while gaming, and that was also demonstrated by our high frame rates. So just something to note based on your use case, but primarily as a gaming laptop, the P960RN did really well. The other negative point I have to say would be that 500GB SSD. I appreciate it is a fast drive and Dream Machines is trying to keep costs down, but in this day and age I do think we need more than 500GB overall. Even when factoring in those 2 points though, for £2,070, I have to say that the P960N has really impressed me. It's a high performance gaming laptop in a thin and light chassis, which is still surprisingly well built. So overall, if you are looking for something that is portable but still high performance, I have to say this is actually a really good machine and is well worth buying. That is pretty much going to do it for this video though, guys. If you liked it, you can toss us a thumbs up. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Would you consider buying this laptop, or do you have your eye on something else? You can also hit subscribe if you haven't already. We'd love to chat with you on Discord, so you can find the invite link for that in the description below. And lastly, if you're not already backing us on Patreon, it would be awesome if you guys would consider doing so. You get to see some of our content early, and we also run some Patreon exclusive giveaways. Until then though guys, I'm Dominic Full Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.